As Scott indicated, I usually start with a topic, and I do have one tonight, and that is feelings and managing uncomfortable feelings, and just some basic things about emotions that I want to just cover some bullet points um, because it just keeps coming up with everybody, of course. I've been in this unusual situation with a hurricane breathing down my neck last week, and I had a lot of feelings about that, a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety. And the people around me I see are having a lot of anxiety and past periods of uncertainty and trauma and all kinds of stuff come to the surface when there's this kind of menacing threat around. So it seemed timely. So these are kind of adapted from a book by a guy named Rick Eisensee called Reclaiming Your Life. It was actually written for gay men, but they're universal. So the first thing I want to say is that feelings are really a natural form of healing. Feelings are the way that we as human beings have, there are gauges and are indicators that to know how we're feeling and that something is good or something is bad or that something is wrong. They're a way of giving us information. They're feedback. And so I think it's really important to kind of frame them in that sense as kind of our friends, right? There are systems that are helping us know what's going on and how we're reacting to things. It's only when they get distorted that they become problematic. And I think it was last week or the week before I mentioned how fear is very useful and important, but fear that kind of doesn't get resolved is anxiety, and that's not as productive. So that's my first point, is that feelings are really a form of natural healing. The second one is that feelings aren't permanent. And I think people get so hung up on afraid to touch feelings. And I understand that. I had some circumstances that had a lot of grief in my life. And at one point, I was just so afraid if I ever actually got in touch with that grief, it would never stop. And it would overwhelm me. And what I've learned is that if I can express feelings and release it, I get past it. If I don't release it, it's going to stay with me and get buried or interfere or whatever. And so these feelings aren't permanent unless we hold on to them. And so that was a huge lesson for me, just to be able to know that it's okay to feel a feeling, to express it, and to let it go. And that really made a huge difference. Third, I don't think we have to justify our feelings. If we're feeling something, there's a reason we're feeling it. And we don't have to justify it to anybody. Feelings belong to us. We can share them. We can share them kindly if we have feelings about someone else. But we don't have to explain why we have those feelings or justify them. Feelings emerge naturally. And sometimes there's inconsistency. Sometimes they may be more justified than other times. But in any case, what we do with them is what's important, not really whether we have to justify even having them or not. The fourth thing is that feelings that we're feeling today really relate to past situations we've lived through before, sometimes a long time ago. So if I had some anxiety about this hurricane coming at me, a lot of that anxiety, I think, was based on past times, some maybe trauma, some not trauma, where I had bad experiences, where I had fear, been through a lot of hurricanes, had some damage, been weeks without power. And so a lot of that was triggered. Even I felt myself feeling it even after the storm. It was pretty conclusively determined that it was not going to come near me, but I still was having those feelings because it was a reaction. And so sometimes if you have a feeling that's out of sync with the situation, if you really react strongly, I had a friend who reacted to a situation that was upsetting but not devastating, just with kind of these hysterical tears, and I didn't know what was wrong with her. But the level of her emotion was tied to other stuff that had happened to her, and the situation here in the present day had echoes of all those past situations, and it brought up all those old feelings. So remember that they're kind of an indicator and also a connection to what might be going on underneath. Boredom and restlessness are interesting players when we talk about feelings, because a lot of people wouldn't identify them as a feeling. I'm not sure they are properly labeled as a feeling. But when you have boredom, it's really kind of a statement that is suppressing uh, a lot of other feelings, or can, and it can lead to trouble. For a lot of chemsex users, meth users, stimulant junkies, whether they're porn and sex addicts or chemsex users, a lot of times boredom is one of the biggest relapse triggering things, because that empty space, there's an intolerance for a lack of stimulation. And so I think boredom is a really important feeling to pay attention to, um, just because it poses a high risk. And also, I think boredom is kind of a placeholder or a default feeling when I should be feeling something else, but I'm not either willing to or can't. Boredom sometimes creeps in. I'm not really bored. I'm often avoiding something. In my case, that may not be true for everybody. Um, Last two, unacknowledged feelings will result in physical symptoms. And so we are one big, beautiful mind body. And when we don't express feelings properly, they will come out. And they'll often come out in the form of physical symptoms, aches, pains, digestive issues, shortness of breath, tightness in the throat. I mean, all those things are classic kind of somatic or body manifestations of unexpressed feeling. So ulcers, having ulcers, right? People having anxiety, stress, chronic stress. So all these things are really important. So if you're having a physical symptom, take a look at it. You know, what is it? And this, I know sounds a little bit out there, but had a lot of training in Gestalt therapy, and I love the idea. I do make my clients do it. You know, if you have a feeling in your stomach, give it a voice. You know, what is it saying? What's the message for you? And just to kind of frame it in those terms sometimes can be very useful. It's like, what is that? So anyway, to sort of pay attention to your body and the feelings that are there. And finally, that we're more likely to get in touch with our feelings if we're in a supportive environment. So if I'm in a place, a home or a situation or an office where I don't feel comfortable revealing myself, because that is a certain form of vulnerability and even intimacy, that's an issue. So I think people do best expressing feelings when they have permission to do it and when they feel safe doing so. And that includes feeling safe to give an opinion that may be something else than some other person in the room, right? So to not exactly flee conflict or avoid conflict, but to really own your feelings, again, not having to justify them, and just be upfront with it. So I think that supportive environment is really important. Sometimes we have some control over that, sometimes we don't. But we certainly always can make progress toward creating a safe environment. And I know I've talked a long, I just want to say one other thing, because I found this other really cool thing, actually by a friend of mine, talking about emotional competencies. And oftentimes when we talk about psychological development, we have milestones, and if you've had kids, you know, there's certain things that have to be done by a certain point, and if they develop competency in one area, then they can build on that for the rest of their lives. But he put together these emotional competencies, and I think it's something that we sometimes miss, and especially with addiction, we often miss them. But there's 5 of them. The first is the ability to experience and name a wide range of emotions. And I think I look at emotions as almost like a vocabulary of a foreign language. And when I first got into recovery, I didn't know very many words. I couldn't identify very many feelings. I just felt bad. And I think as we get into recovery, we start to get a more elaborate and be able to name those feelings. But to be able to feel and name them, excuse me, is an important competence. To manage emotions is another important competency, meaning that if I have something distressing, I can handle it, manage it without having a meltdown, or without using drugs, or without acting out sexually. So it's that ability to regulate our emotions. And that's one of the critical things I think that is essential in early recovery. Along with that is the third one, which is the ability to shift the emotional state. So if I wake up feeling angry about something, I'm not even sure why, the ability of me to take that, process it, let the anger go, and shift it into something else, shift into something more positive. Because if I can't do that, I'm going to be trapped. in a really unpleasant feeling that's just going to make me crazy, and it's going to probably also trigger some addiction thoughts. Two more, ability to linger with their emotions and learn and heal with them. I think once we learn how to feel feelings in recovery, I think it's often we just want to feel them and get rid of them. And it's the ability to kind of sit with it and savor it and take all the lessons that feeling might have and play with it, I think is really important. And then finally, for feelings, the ability, he wrote this competency to expand one's ability and capacity for empathy, to understand, okay, once we work through our feelings, we need to get a handle on what other people are feeling. And we humans have that innate capability through mirror neurons and other things in our brain to be able to really relate and put ourselves in someone else's shoes. We can feel other people. Sometimes addicts have lost that ability and they need to reclaim it, but it's there and it's inherent. So I've talked on along. Some of you may have feelings about that, but please ask questions about that or anything, and we're ready to go. Thanks.
Thank you, David. For everybody who got here late, today's topic is feelings, what they are and how we manage them. The first thing David covered was that feelings are our friends. They teach us things about our environment and what's going on and what we might need to do with ourselves. And then the last bit, I think everybody was here for, talking about emotional competency, being able to experience and name a wide range of feelings, manage, regulate emotions, shift our emotional state, linger with and learn from our feelings, and then expand our capacity for empathy, which is great stuff. And I see we have a question already, so feel free to ask questions about this or any other topic in the Q&A. That's the best way to go about it, and we'll get them answered if we can. So David, our first question says, hi guys, first of all, I want to thank you. You're welcome. Okay. My therapist and I went through some of the SDI, which is the sexual dependency inventory. It's about a 93,000 word question assessment about sex addiction.
Yeah.
I really panicked, asked you about it last week. You guys really helped me through the feelings I was going through. I have a partner. We've been together 15 months. I wasn't in recovery when we met. We were attracted to each other because we were both unable to be intimate. That does happen. I'm making some good headway on expressing my feelings. Can you give me some thoughts on a partner that isn't in the same place in terms of sharing how he feels?
Great question. And congratulations on all the work you're doing. That's terrific. And actually the ability to put your concerns out there and receive some help and take it in. So good for you. This is an issue that a lot of couples have in recovery, especially early recovery, because they're kind of out of sync. And especially if you've chosen each other before recovery. So sometimes the choices we make when we're in an addictive state are different than the people we might choose later. Doesn't mean it's wrong, but that's sometimes the case. I think patience is required. This is a process. You're in a process. Your partner is in a process, and you may not be at the same place. And I think that's something that is really often experienced by couples. And I would just really encourage each of you having independent support systems. Each of you have your own therapist. Each of you have maybe your own recovery groups. And oftentimes partners balk at, why should I need a therapist? He's the one with the problem. But and we're not pathologizing partners or anybody else, but it's just in our experience, we found it really helpful to the partner to have someone who's their advocate and who can point out patterns on their behalf, and move them along toward reclaiming that intimacy that you want. So I guess that's a long way of saying my recommendation would be to continue doing your own work individually, be gentle with each other, be patient and tolerant with each other, and communicate and say where you're at. And I think at this stage, because there is the potential to kind of grow apart. I've seen that with couples. I think the way to avoid that is really good communication and communication skills. And I would recommend, there's a kind of couples therapy called Imago, IMAGO therapy that talks about, they have a structured communication skill, basically. It's a dialogue that's really helpful for situations like that. So, but anyway, there's many other ways of communication skills, but I would, be gentle, be patient, each do your own work with your own support systems, but stay in constant touch and communicate, including your needs. And that last point we talked about, empathy. I think really being able to put yourself in your partner's shoes and hopefully get the same in return, so you can really work on this together. There's a lot of healing that has to take place in a relationship like that, even a relatively new relationship. So yeah, good for you. Good luck with the work.
Thank you, David. Our next question, what are recommendations for dealing with boredom?
Boredom. So first of all, just approach it with warily, because I think boredom can also always be kind of problematic. Open space, unplanned time, unstructured time, feeling a lack of stimulation can really start to add up to trouble for people. And so I recommend just getting busy with healthy things. And if you're in sex recovery, you probably know the boundary plan and that outer circle kind of activity. There's lots of stuff usually in those outer circles that can help us move past boredom. To me, much like I always say, anger is secondary to some underlying feeling like hurt or sadness. I think boredom kind of is the same way. Boredom is kind of like this camouflage state that really is kind of covering over something else. And it may be hurt, maybe shame, it may be not feeling good about oneself. I don't know. But I think I always ask people who are feeling anger or boredom to drill down underneath that, drop down underneath the boredom. What's there? What do you feel? And you may not feel anything, but it's worth doing that to see. But then just get up and go. One of the slogans I got very sick of hearing in the first 5 years of my recovery was act as if, where you have to kind of get out, and even though I wasn't in the mood to do something, I kind of made myself get up and do it. And almost always, if I can get started on something, it catches fire. I can go forward with it. There is one other piece I'll just mention, depending on the addiction. So sex, porn addiction, and chemsex all are intensity, stimulation-related addictions. And so sitting with boredom is going to be a real challenge, and it's a real danger point. So I'd be careful. I've seen people, not even when they're bored, but when things are going really well, they kind of mess something up, and all of a sudden we have drama. And so just be cautious about that. But I think the best thing you can do is just find activities that really feed you, that are pleasant for you, that help you grow in your recovery. Scott, do you have any comment on boredom?
Well, you hit the biggest one for me that I learned in my recovery was look at what's in your outer circle. Do something in your outer circle, or the outer boundary, whatever terminology you use. Boredom is, without question, one of my top two triggers. It's just horrible for me. I don't handle it very well. And for several years, I carried a printed version of my outer circle. Didn't have to carry the inner circle or the middle. I had to carry the outer circle so that I could pull it out on my wallet and go, oh, I can do this right now. Now, I struggled with some of the stuff because there were feelings under the boredom, like shame and guilt, and I don't deserve to have fun, and nobody wants to hang out with me because I'm a horrible person. All that, I had to work through all of that. Nowadays, I got a cat. I play with the cat. My house is very, very clean because when I get bored, I clean.
Come visit.
That's what everybody says, but you just have to find. I don't know. When the place is clean, I feel better about myself, and then I feel like going and doing something. Then I've earned my reward to go have some fun. So I kind of have to play a little game with myself sometimes to just get out of it. One of the things I hear in 12-step meetings sometimes is, and it's usually when somebody's depressed, somebody will pop up with this little nugget, but I think it works with boredom too. When you're walking through hell, don't stop. Keep walking. You'll get to the other side. And that's kind of how I deal with boredom. I just don't sit there with it. That's the one feeling I don't sit with. Other feelings I'll sit with, not that one. So.
Great.
Okay. Excuse me. How can you tell if what you are feeling is appropriate? Meaning having a feeling because of an actual situation versus having a feeling and creating a scenario around that feeling, or I would think kind of post-traumatic feelings that you talked about a little bit earlier. Example, I come home and feel angry, so I unconsciously create a scenario around my anger. My husband tends to see feelings as facts, and once he solidifies his thought process, I can't convince him he is seeing things in a distorted way. There's about 4 questions in there.
Yeah, that's a really interesting comment. So I think the main kernel in there for me is how do you tell when your feelings are appropriate? And that's a big concern. I remember when I first got sober, feelings were a new thing for me. I wasn't used to handling them or feeling them or expressing them. And it was pretty awkward. I mean, I wasn't a smooth communicator. It was weird for me to assert myself. It was weird for me to share any feelings with people, including people that were very close to me who I'd been very walled off from. So all this was new and strange. And it took me a while and took some practice in terms of learning how to express them with a little bit of, in a non-judgmental way, in a way that conveyed my feeling without explaining, without justifying it, as I talked about, but expressing it accurately. Now, also in that kind of swirl of stuff, though, was this question that you asked. All right, I'm feeling this. I'm having maybe a really strong feeling about something. Is that really related to the situation in front of me, or is this something else? And over the years, that's gotten better. But in the beginning, there were a lot of something else's there. Everything was spilling over into everything else. So I was reacting more than almost any other feeling. I was just kind of responding to people and responding to triggers because I was kind of awake for the first time in years. And it took me a while to discern what was my feeling based on an interaction with whatever is going on in my life at that moment versus what does this situation remind me of in my past, and trying to learn and get to know myself a little bit better to know that, well, in these situations, I tend to react X, Y, Z because of my history. And so to learn how to manage that and learn how to react in a new way. But it took some time, but for me, once I got it, it became pretty clear. And I think it was more of a feeling than figuring it out, but I can feel when a reaction is kind of correct and in the moment versus when I'm kind of pulling up stuff from my past and reacting from a different place. So I think it just takes practice. I think it's pretty routine for people in newly recovering people to be a little awkward. I think sometimes if they've been pretty passive aggressive, say, we're aiming for assertiveness, but they may get into kind of aggressiveness as they kind of practice how to express themselves and have opinions. But that all works itself out. But I think the core of your question is that ability to discern. And for me, it was more of a feeling and just feedback from other people that I trusted. And that was really helpful, by the way, because I had no internal indicators that I could trust on what was appropriate in terms of the level of my reaction or the feelings I was having. And so to have people like a sponsor or a friend say, whoa, you kind of had a strong reaction to that, or, I might have said this, that kind of modeling was really helpful for me in the beginning.
Yeah, in early recovery for me, because I had spent 30 years avoiding feeling anything, good or bad, even the slightest feelings felt overwhelming for me, and I could just take them and run with them. And what I really struggled with was feelings from other people. And that was a very difficult thing. If you were having a feeling, that was very difficult for me to deal with because I had no sense of empathy at that point. And at the time, I was working for someone who, in retrospect, was a rageaholic. So it was really, really difficult for me. And one of the great pieces of advice, being on the receiving end of kind of feelings run amok, is I learned to say, "Are you mad at me or something else?" And that actually worked, because it would kind of stop him in his tracks, and he would say, "No, I'm not mad at you." I'm like, okay. And then I was okay. But really dealing with my own feelings, I still struggle with it. It's over for a while.
Yeah, I think it's easy to get kind of overly empathetic too, and kind of be too sensitive to other people, and have that inhibit what I'm feeling. So we have to be careful with all of that.
Yeah, I think it's a pendulum early on. You just and eventually it runs out of steam, and you end up kind of in the middle, a little bit, instead of at the extremes. But
right,
a long time in the extremes. It's
right,
not pleasant for me or the people around me, I suspect.
right. And it's we're kind of waking up, right, and learning how to manage this stuff, and it's not smooth and easy in the beginning, especially.
So we are halfway through, and I have been told I'm supposed to do a little commercial here halfway through all our webinar. Just a reminder that Seeking Integrity offers residential treatment for sex addiction, porn addiction, and paired substance abuse and sexual behaviors. Dr. Fawcett is our Vice President of Clinical Programming. Did I get that right? Am I finally? Okay, he's nodding. I got it right. Yeah, it's a great program. So if anyone is dealing with that, or knows someone who's dealing with that and needs treatment, give us a call or contact us via email. With that, type in some more questions. I have a couple of questions for you, David, and this one actually it was a question I had earlier, and I'm pulling it from our previous question. And I hear this in AA meetings a lot. People will say, feelings aren't facts. And I've been in recovery for close to 20 years, and I still don't know what that means.
Yeah, that's a common one. I think it's a very confusing one too. And I kind of share your, like, what I make of that is that whatever I'm feeling, first of all, is impermanent, and it's not necessarily an accurate response to whatever the situation is. And so if I'm feeling really upset about something, it may not be that situation at all, but it may be related to something totally different. And so I think it's just a matter of saying feelings are transient, they come and they go. What we're responding may not be related to the situation we think it is. And in that sense, I think it's not a factual representation of that transaction. So yeah, I think it's to me speaks to the transient nature of it, the fact that a lot of our history is part of the formula that creates these feelings that we're experiencing, and it may not be totally 100% related to whatever is in front of us. So yeah, I don't necessarily like that phrase, but I
don't either. I'm having a feeling that's a fact. May not be related to any current facts. But let me ask you about that. We kind of touched on it, and I mentioned PTSD. You did not. But things that happened a long time ago, we have feelings about them now, unconsciously. When something in the present happens, it reminds us of whatever it is that happened a long time ago. Can you talk a little about that, David?
Yeah. So when we experience trauma, that kind of overwhelms our capacity to process it, it kind of gets stuck in the part of the brain that basically takes apart an event and the memory of it, and they file them kind of separately. It takes an emotional piece and separates it from the event. When we're traumatized, that process gets kind of stuck. And so that event never gets kind of filed into our memory. Anytime we think of the event, we have the emotions that go with it, the pangs of anxiety or the terror or the grief, or all that stuff is still attached to it. And the normal function, the way the human brain should function, is to kind of strip away the emotion. We have a memory of the emotion, but we don't feel it in real time. We remember the emotion we felt, we remember the memory of the incident, but we're not reliving the incident. With trauma, that system gets interrupted. And so anything that kind of starts to relate, and we start to build these chains of connected memories, and they can be things that are totally unrelated in the real world. But if the feeling is the same, there's what we call a somatic bridge, a bridge of feelings that connect these things one to the other. And so if we're triggered in some way by something, if it connects or resonates or kind of echoes some previous trauma I've had, it's going to activate that chain, and it's going to make me go right back to those original feelings of terror or grief, whatever, and I'll feel them almost as strongly as I did originally, but related to this incident here today. And so I might have, say if I have some trauma around anxiety or safety, I might have an incident in my life where I feel unsafe, walking down the street in a dark street I don't know or something, and have a feeling of real terror that's kind of out of sync with the situation, but it's really reflecting my past experience of trauma. And that is PTSD. And what we do in trauma therapy is really go through and resolve those connections so we can file those away as they should be. So the goal of trauma therapy is not to forget the trauma. The goal of trauma therapy is to have a memory of the trauma, but not have a reaction to it every time it's brought up or something reminds us of it. So it's a subtle difference, but it's something that really is important. And it explains a lot of the feelings when people overreact, when people, this has happened to me, I'm sure it happens to everybody. It's like really overcome with a strong feeling. It's like, wow, where did that come from? What is that about? And that always is a useful nugget to go back and kind of look, gee, what's that connected to? What was that? It's really useful stuff.
That actually leads us directly into the next question. I have issues overreacting to certain situations, especially when having an emotional flashback. What is the best way to catch myself before I overreact?
That's a great question. It's really hard because those reactions that you're talking about are not a conscious process. You're not saying to myself, gee, I'm going to react this way. It's an automatic thing. And the problem is that we're in it before we even are aware of it sometimes. We're reacting, we're expressing some emotions, sometimes inappropriately, before we've even thought about it. So I think the best thing I recommend is to really start developing an awareness. Mindfulness is great for that, where you can sort of see what are the precursors, what are the feelings, what are the situations, the scenarios that kind of trigger me, and really try to catch it as soon as you can. And I would practice it, much like we do a relapse prevention plan, where you kind of devise, okay, if I have that thought, instead of, as we've talked about in this webinar before, you can't say, don't do that, but what are you going to do? What are you going to think about? What are you going to tell yourself? And some positive affirming statement or some action. And in my experience, personally, when I just had an awareness of that, it took time, but gradually I could learn when I was about to overreact like that and catch myself. And then the other piece of that is to really go back and see, what is that reaction connected to? What that's totally unrelated to this particular circumstance. Is it related to trauma? Is it related to old unresolved feelings? And to really dig down a little bit and see what old stuff that's connected to, because there's something there driving that. But the only way, because we do drop into those states automatically, we have to really learn how to catch ourselves before we are, fully committed to that emotional reaction.
Yeah, it's and it's hard. One of the primary lessons of my childhood was I'm really good at everything, but I'm never good enough at anything. And it was that last bit that was horrible trauma for me. You're good, but you're not good enough, ever. So I don't handle any sort of criticism even constructive criticism, my initial response is always not the right response. And, I was in LA a couple of weeks ago, and Dr. Rob was at his office, and he kind of waved me in, and he said, "Close the door, this is going to take a while." And of course, I immediately panicked. I've done something horrible. He's going to fire, and that wasn't it at all. There was a situation, and he wanted my opinion and thoughts on it. It was the exact opposite of my initial reaction. And just paying attention to that over the years, I've learned to, not express my panic, to just wait and see what the situation is, or think, okay, what is the reality? What am I reacting to? Oh, I'm not reacting to Dr. Rob, I'm reacting to my mother.
Right.
But not so easy.
And that's a great example, Scott, because we often think of that, because that happens with couples, obviously, right? Couples do that all the time with each other, but it happens elsewhere, like the workplace, which are kind of a family too. We have all those family dynamics that we replicate in any situation we're in. And so, yeah, that's a great example. Great example.
You mentioned, I want to ask this before I forget, you mentioned Gestalt therapy earlier. I think a lot of people maybe don't know what that is, and you kind of explained it, but could you tell us in a little more detail? Because, this kind of relates to, the body knows what's happening. I always think I think it's Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Knows the Score, which is dealing with trauma, but, trauma and feelings are so interrelated. We somatically react to all of these things. And Gestalt is a way out of that.
Right. So Gestalt therapy is this kind of really cool therapy that was developed by a guy named Fritz Perls. And it really is a therapy that isn't so cognitively oriented. It's not a talk therapy necessarily. It's kind of more of a feeling acting therapy. And it really kind of encourages one to drop out of the role of our adult self sometime and drop into body parts. Like the example I give your pain a voice. What would it say? Like you're strangling me. If that's a voice, Jude, you're strangling me. What am I doing? Is it me? Is there somebody else? Am I being, compressed? So that's just sometimes when I've done it myself or when I'm doing it with clients, amazing stuff comes out. And the technique is to have a client say something and then become that voice. And you shift your body a little bit and have a dialogue. Other things you can do, it merges well with psychodrama, where we externalize internal shadows and processes and give them a voice. And so we can assign roles, you can assign characters. We can take a pillow from my office sofa and make it something, or make it someone's shame, and they can get rid of it by throwing it away. I mean, it kind of makes it all three-dimensional and interactive. And I think it really is a great way to bypass, especially for people that are in their head a lot, and they're very good at defending and rationalizing. It kind of gets around that, and it can be a really fun and colorful kind of adjunct therapy for people. I love it. It's fun. It's kind of fallen out of fashion, but I think it'll come back.
Yeah, I like it. I agree. It's fun. In terms of the body knows the score, when somebody's having a situation like, a PTSD or an emotional flashback, what are they normally feeling? What parts of the body tend to be activated or?
Right. So feelings tend to get stuck in a few places in the body, although not always. They can be everywhere, but oftentimes the stomach, the chest, and the throat, and the temples. Those I think are the big four that where a lot of people hold stuff. Also shoulders up here, and it depends on the person. But oftentimes feelings, for whatever reason, will get kind of stuck in those places, and those places will continue to be activated and react when that trauma stuff is triggered, and those in turn will drive feelings that are verbal. So that the body piece is really important. awareness of. So I always really encourage people to really get to know their body, get to know their reactions. That's where mindfulness is so great, because it's like it's connecting the dots. Just, gee, if I'm feeling, uncertain about myself, and I'm noticing I have a lump in my throat, maybe there's a connection, maybe there's something I can learn from that. So I think just paying attention to the body, because I think our body often, I love the phrase, it's really honest with us in a way that our minds can kind of deceive us. And the body is going to be straightforward. There's no deception. There's no, it is what it is. And so I think that's important. The other thing about PTSD, though, just to mention in this regard, is that oftentimes people are in a sort of shock, and they disconnect from the body. And so oftentimes I have to be aware of that too. If I'm asking a client, what are you feeling, in your body? And I've had a lot of clients say, I'm not feeling anything. And I sort of know at that point they're disconnected, they're dissociated, they're out of their body, which is a very common response for trauma. That's how we protect ourselves. We kind of float away. And so that's one important thing, just to make sure you're in your body and then start to check out what's going on. And it's very common, especially early on, I think one of those skills I talked about is learning to sit with a feeling. Before we get good at that, it's very easy to feel a feeling and dissociate or avoid it, kind of flee it, not feel it, not want to feel it. So this is all kind of a package to build. But I think the body is so critical. I think I've mentioned here before, I do a form of somatic therapy called breath work, which is, I describe it as kind of hyperventilating for 90 minutes on your back, which doesn't sound like a fun time, but it's really incredible because it releases stress and trauma that the body has held, and it's non-cognitive. It just kind of happens. But I've seen miracles in that too, where people just really having tremendous healing from releasing this stuff through all these kind of non-traditional formats. So don't be limited. There's a whole world out there besides talk therapy. And that's why we incorporated Seeking Integrity, some experiential stuff, art therapy or equine or ropes. And it's really important to get those other parts of the brain working in this healing process.
Yeah. I love this last question here. Could emotions get stuck in our naughty bits?
Yes. That's funny. So yeah, I've had clients over the years who have basically sexualized feelings. And what I mean by that is they, if they were just angry people, they oftentimes got in relationships where the bond with their partner was just like constant fighting, arguing, and it's this expression of anger, and that was their bond. And that was, in a way, they had sexualized anger. I think it's easy for us to sexualize. And this happens with arousal templates sometimes. They can get kind of distorted, where we can sexualize unhealthy things, right? So victimization or offending kinds of behaviors, and other kinds of aspects of ourselves that we don't really want to face directly sometimes can become easily sexualized and attached. And remember, an orgasm gives us about 200 units of dopamine, which is the greatest natural reward we can get. That's the highest burst of reward we can get from any activity without drugs. And what that does is it connects whatever the trigger was with that feeling of pleasure. And so if we start to match having an orgasm, if I'm really angry with somebody and my relief for that is to go masturbate, that's going to start to be paired after a while. And that anger and the masturbation is going to start to be paired. So yes, I mean, these things can really be merged, and it takes some work to undifferentiate them, because that's really important to do as well. That can really, so it's similar to somebody who's on chemsex. If they're using meth, their sexual functioning almost becomes dependent on the meth. If we have somebody who's merged some other emotion, like anger, with some kind of sexual activity, if we take away their anger, the sexual activity goes with it. So we need to learn how to recreate a healthy sexuality that's not connected to those feelings in our naughty bits. So,
A naughty bits. You should always read that with an English accent.
right, right.
David, I wanted to, you talked about, one of the things you talked about early was we're more likely to get in touch with our feelings in a supportive environment. Can you talk a little bit about the various supportive environments that people might encounter if they're trying to get in touch with their feelings, besides just a supportive family, which probably none of us had if we're on this webinar?
Right. That's a criteria. Yeah, so by supportive environment, I mean something that's safe. A safe container I'll use, if I'm in it, where I feel safe to be vulnerable to, because really when I express a feeling, I'm taking a risk, right? I'm taking a risk. You may not like me, you may react poorly, you may think differently. All of those things may be swirling around in my head. So to have the confidence and feel safe to share without fear of being shamed or judged or shut down or told I'm stupid or that I have no right to that feeling, all that stuff. If we are expecting those kind of reactions, not going to be comfortable sharing. And so we can translate that directly to treatment. One of the things we do is really create a safe container for people where they can come and start to feel that they can say whatever's on their mind without being judged or shamed or kicked out. And so I think that's really important that we try to recreate that same sense in our lives. And so for me, that meant early on really being pretty judgmental, I guess, in terms of looking at my friends. And I found that a lot of the people that I was close to when I was in my disease were not the people that were helping me create a supportive, healing environment for myself. And so I had to let go of a lot of people. And some of that it was very easy. Some of them were really kind of painful because there was a lot of history there. And those people just couldn't, we're on different pages, kind of like the couple that was in the question earlier, just on different trajectories and different paths. So I think it's important that we find those people that are safe, that we create that safety for us, and that we choose to be in environments like meetings, like groups, like with trusted family, close friends, where we know that we're going to get an affirmative response, no matter what we have to say. And there's layers of stuff, right? If I'm feeling great, I mean, that's easy. That's easy to share. There's no risk there. But when in recovery, when we start to get into some of these older, more painful situations, things that happened to us, things that were done to us, all that stuff carries a lot of emotion. And I'm always incredibly impressed with the bravery that when people can start to reveal that and talk about it. But the magic potion there is having a safe place in which they can reveal it. And it's a mistake to try to share stuff in the wrong environment because you're going to get hurt. So I think we have to develop at least intuition about what's safe and what's not. And if it's a 12-step meeting, that doesn't automatically mean it's safe, because there are some terrible meetings, at least here where I live, and there's some wonderful meetings. But boy, if I walk into a terrible meeting and don't have a sense of this is not being run well, I could very well end up being shamed or humiliated or embarrassed or whatever. It's not going to be productive. So I think just to recreate a sense of safety where we can be vulnerable and be who we are.
Yeah, I remember, I think the therapist that actually helped me was the third one I'd had over the years. The first two, they couldn't help me because I didn't tell them the truth. And the reason I didn't tell them the truth was I didn't feel safe enough to tell them the truth. I needed a therapist who dealt with sexual issues because that was my problem. And finally, when I got to one who specialized in that and who just was not freaked out by anything, that's when I finally started to feel safe. And then I went to treatment, and treatment was really the first time I had been in a group of people and felt safe to tell the truth ever in my life. And it was kind of an amazing experience for me. And it's something that I'm really glad that I had that experience, because it was something that I initially unconsciously and later consciously sought to recreate in the wider world. You know, I had to, after treatment, I had to come back and start living life again. And, you know, like David, I had to reevaluate pretty much every relationship in my life. I couldn't let go of family because they're family, but there is almost nobody else left from the years of active addiction. They're just all gone. Because I live my life differently than they do. And sometimes they come into recovery and we get to be friends again, but sometimes not.
You know, the one nice thing about that, just I had, through my addiction, I had lost touch with people earlier, really good people that were wonderful, like college friends and stuff, and people I grew up with. And in recovery, a lot of those people, I've rediscovered them. It was kind of a bridge over the kind of toxic relationships back into really helpful, supportive people from my past. Because I think it's really important for us to have people that have known us, if we're fortunate enough, you know they've known us for 20 years or 30 or 40 years. That's huge perspective for me, you know, to have a friend that can remember when and help me. So those long-term friendships are important, but they've got to be healthy.
I think we have time for one more quick question, and I will ask it. You went over the 5 emotional competencies, which are pulled from Rick Eisenstein's book. Being able to experience and name a wide range of emotions, being able to manage and regulate emotions, being able to shift your emotional state. I think you used the example of waking up on the wrong side of the bed and just being able to kind of go, take a deep breath, figure out what's real, what's not, and move forward. Being able to sit with your emotions and learn to deal with them. And then the last one here, expand one's capacity for empathy. How does that work?
So I think empathy is one of those incredible topics that is such a key concern for everyone. And I think it's something with these intensity addictions, particularly with sex and porn and chemsex, because of the kind of selfish aspect of a lot of the addictive behavior and the objectification of other people, empathy really gets pushed. And so empathy really is this ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And I think it doesn't just happen. I think we have to practice it and feel it. And to me, the best place to do that is a group setting where people can get feedback about, or even suggestions on how to start to relate to other people, how to do it. They can practice in a safe place by feeling something or not, and just start to work through it. But I think empathy it's not a trait, it's a skill. And I think it's a skill that we're born with, but addiction kind of destroys. But we can recreate it. But it takes work, and you have to really, it takes caring about someone, and it takes an investment in whatever relationship it is. But I think it's something that's absolutely doable and essential, because I think if healing is going to take place, and I'll say there's empathy in a couple of ways. Empathy with the people that have been affected by our addiction, particularly partners or friends or family, to really understand the impact we've had. That's a key component of my healing, to really understand what I did and take responsibility for that. But there's also empathy for me. And I would say self-compassion, or that's really important too, because I've seen addicts go through and feel just so self-critical and so harsh with themselves. And, you know, and addicts do bad stuff, and we have a process of the steps to kind of try to work through that and make amends. But at some point, it takes a degree of forgiveness and empathy for ourselves that we have to, you know, I love that phrase, you know, I'm a good person who did bad things. And I think it's kind of a way of starting to differentiate those two things. But empathy, there's plenty of room for empathy on everybody's part, both for the people that we love in our lives and for ourselves.
So can we develop empathy at the same time we learn to identify our own feelings, or do we need to be able to deal with our own feelings before?
I would like to say you can do them both, but I think the sequence is really getting to learn our own feelings and start to handle those. Otherwise, how can we even understand what someone else is feeling if we don't know what that feeling feels like? So yeah, I think it really has to do some work on ourselves first.
Yeah, that was certainly my experience.
Yeah.
So it would appear that we are out of time, everyone. So thank you for joining us. David, I'm glad you didn't get washed away by Dorian.
Me too. I have feelings about that.
That you were able to join us tonight. We will be back next Wednesday, same time, same place, and we hope we'll see you all there. David, anything you want to say?
No, just everybody enjoy the week. Be safe. We'll see you next week. All right. Take care. Thanks, Scott.
Bye, everybody.